Hello, everyone, and welcome to Debra and Peter are doing a podcast, question and answer special. And we've been delighted to receive some questions from our listeners, and we're going to have a go at answering some of them. Some we might both answer, some one of us might answer, and if we're completely stumped, there'll just be an awkward silence. So, Debra, let's start with what has been your favourite campaign that you've been involved with whilst in the sector, and why?
Now, this is going to sound really weird, Peter. Most of our campaigns are about the sector as a whole, and this is one in particular. So my favourite campaign, which we haven't won, but we haven't given up, was our big lottery refund campaign. So I don't know if you remember, back in, I think it was 2008, was it something like that? The then Labour government, in our view, stole our very precious charity money from the lottery to use to spend on the Olympics. And we were absolutely outraged at the time. We wrote oh God, I'm still not speaking properly. We wrote loads of letters and all the rest of it. And it just, and they basically made these commitments that it would be paid back out of the sale of the assets, blah, 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 blah. And of course, what happened was absolutely outrageous things happened. Like they sold, for example, the Millennium Stadium to, I think it was West Ham. On a 100-year lease. So not a cat in hell's chance of us getting our money back because they weren't going to sell it or whatever. Anyway, we did all sorts of campaigns. We talked about the fact that they could put a lien, so that it wouldn't make the government's books worse. But what they could do is they could give us back the money. Anyway, I won't bang on about it. We haven't actually given up. So we still rears its ugly head occasionally. I mean, it's a long time on. But basically, Labour broke its promises. Then the Tories didn't honour those promises because they backed those promises up, and we still have not had back £425 million worth of lottery money that was stolen. So that's been my favourite campaign. And I say it sounds weird because obviously we weren't successful at it. But we were so united and felt so passionate about it, and our arguments were so strong. So yeah, it's not always the campaigns you win, I think, that are your favourites. Sometimes it's the ones that that fire in your belly about the injustice of it all.
I used to be a real expert on that subject when I was the chief executive of the Big Lottery Fund, and your campaign was both extremely encouraging and also at times frustrating because I almost knew too much about it, and I knew exactly where, in theory, the money was going to come from, and at times it looked like there would be a moment when it would be returned, but
never happened.
No. My favourite campaign, I think, would be the Wild West Web campaign, which the NSPCC ran to regulate the internet. And I remember us sitting in a meeting and someone saying that the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport at the time, who was this young, ambitious cabinet minister called Matt Hancock, whatever happened to him, had a really big ego, and we should have a campaign that played to his ego and encouraged him to believe that he would be the man who could tame the internet. And so we created the Wild West Web campaign. We created a sheriff's badge and a sort of moon pig type card, which mocked him up as the sheriff with a big hat. And we wrote to him at the time we launched the Wild West Web campaign to say, Secretary of State Matt Hancock, you are the man we believe in to tame the internet. Please find enclosed your sheriff's badge. And I'd almost forgotten that we'd done it when he texted me, and I've still got the picture of Matt Hancock wearing his sheriff's badge, saying, "Thanks very much, Peter. I accept the challenge. I'm fully behind your campaign," which was quite extraordinary because the government hadn't quite committed to regulating the internet.
And did he do anything?
Yeah, he got sort of bit between the teeth. We went to see him and had sort of meetings. And I remember again being in a meeting saying, what is it that makes you think that the 13th self-regulatory code is going to have any more power than the 12th or the 11th? And, you're the sheriff. Come on, Matt, step up. And there we are. So we ended up with an online safety bill. We ended up with the Hancock ego going from strength to strength and ending up in I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. And the rest is history. So yeah, so for those who work in, PR and campaigns, know your target audience and what will trigger them, because
that's so clever.
Yeah.
That's so clever. Yeah, we should have done something different with the lottery campaign now on reflection. But I mean, hindsight is a marvelous thing, as we've always said before. The thing about hindsight is it's free, but it's also painful.
That's true. Another question?
Yeah, sure.
What's your greatest pleasure and what's your greatest pain from your time as a charity CEO?
Well, both of mine are about people. So if I start with the greatest pain for me is the times when I've had to let people go for whatever reason. Sometimes it's because I've made them redundant. Sometimes it's because we've said that they weren't suited for DSC anymore, whatever those reasons. I've always found that horribly painful, more painful for them, of course. Let's not be self-indulgent about this, but I've never liked it. And I've always been super upset and traumatized and agonized over those kind of decisions. So that's the horriblest pain, is when you have to let people go. But then the converse of that is the greatest pleasure, is when you see people grow. So, I mean, I can think of loads of examples of fantastic people in my organization. My directors, for example, who came in at much more junior levels to what they are now and have grown to become directors of DSC. And there's one person in particular I think of. So she was, in fact, you would come across her, Peter. She was my exec office manager, Bronwyn, her name was. And she worked for us for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, probably, maybe a bit longer. I can't remember because, I'm over 60. And so she was my exec office manager. She went from us to work for DCMS, and she's now the head of strategy at the UK Space Agency. And so one of my greatest pleasures is seeing people grow and develop and go on to do amazing things, not necessarily outside DSC. I mean, that's an example of somebody who moved on outside, but also inside of DSC, and they grow their skills. I mean, José, our podcaster, came to us as a facilities assistant, many years ago, and is now, our marketing and development officer and does the podcast and all the rest of it. And it's so joyful for me when that happens. So those two things, I think, off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I think my greatest pleasure, and I may have said this before, was, and I did it a few times, sitting in the back of a primary school assembly and hearing all the little children shout out, "I have the right to be happy and safe," at the end of the Speak Out, Stay Safe assembly, because for them to have that sense of agency and belief and confidence in themselves is just delightful. Having received a product which is about the abuse and neglect of children, and so many people say, don't scare little children about these issues, but actually what you're doing is giving them
courage and confidence.
Yeah. And if only they could shout that out when they're teenagers, everything would be a whole lot better. Great as pain. So many kind of challenging times that you want to forget, really. I think that I found it most painful when people questioned my intent as the chief executive, in moments where difficult choices had to be made, and there was no easy solution. And it comes back to conversation we've had on previous podcasts about there just isn't enough resource to go around sometimes, or times are changing and you need to do something different. So in taking a decision and fronting it up for something which you believe to be in the best interests of the charity looking forwards, people question your intent and try and create a sort of a competition of compassion, is what I would kind of call it, and they present themselves as they must care more about the cause, they must care more about the charity than you, because how could you possibly do this terrible thing to these people, or at the expense of something else, and that is hard, because you kind of want to say, look, of course I didn't come here to do this, I'd like to do everything, but that those are the sort of most painful times, and you can't help then kind of just going home and worrying about if you've done the right thing and do they really care more than you do, and have you become a heartless person because you just know the price of everything and the value of nothing, and
which is always what they say.
That's hard.
Well, actually, I think that segues beautifully into the question about what advice would you give to someone considering starting a career in the charity sector. And for me, it's always about, you need to really, well, you can't really be prepared, but you need to be prepared, because the thing about the charity sector is that it's not particularly well paid for the most part. There are some well paid people, but not that many. Most of us are like average or slightly below average salaries. And so you need to really want to do it, because it's one of the most stressful, emotionally draining roles you can take. Because the problem is you care passionately about the cause. You will end up loving the people that you serve, really caring about the cause, really thinking that your issue matters. And so it can be absolutely devastating when you let down a beneficiary for whatever reason. You lose somebody, or when you lose a battle with a local authority over a policy issue. It's not, I'm not saying that people who work in the private sector don't care about their work, because I'm sure they do, but I'd be very surprised if it has the same emotionally draining energy as when you're working with a young person to try and help them rebuild their life back together, or you're working with someone who you're trying to help them manage their addiction and free themselves up from their addictions, and they fall back off the wayside. That stuff is absolutely heartbreaking. So I think you have to it's a tough job. There was a nurse friend of mine who once said to me, if you can't stand blood, shit and death, don't be a nurse. And I think that translates well to our sector. If you can't stand the emotional turmoil, if you can't stand the stress of it, if you can't, and the constant anxiety about money, then it's not the job for you. And it's not even necessarily that all that is forced upon you because you've got bad managers or bad boards or whatever. It's just the nature of the work that we do. And I think it's true in lots of public sector, public service facing roles as well. So I would say, just make sure you've got the resilience to be able to handle it, because it is really tough.
Yeah, I think you need to get into a position where you do what you can in the time available, and that absolutely doesn't mean be a clock watcher. But it sort of does mean that in most of the jobs in our sector, you could do them 24/7, 7 days a week, and there's still going to be an awful lot of need out there. So you have to find a way to convince yourself and be convinced by others that if you do the best you can, then that's fine. The other bit of advice I would give to new people early on in their careers is be curious, ask questions, because none of us know very much at all, and showing an interest and exploring the issues. There are no silly questions. I know it's a kind of cliche, but I was always, really impressed by people who just wanted to find out more, wanted to chip in. There's so much to learn, and there's so much space to make a positive difference on the things that you discover need to be done, because the tasks are so immense that compared with some other jobs where you might, in a very regimented fashion, be told this is the job you do, this is the time you have to do it. So it's kind of balancing that. Don't imagine that because the challenge is vast and it's multi-dimensional, you have to be responsible for it all. But at the same time, walk towards the problems, walk towards the challenges, ask the questions, because you'll then feel a part of something and people will appreciate you.
Yeah, I can't remember if I talked about this before on the podcast. We've done loads now, so we're bound to repeat ourselves. But people talk about in the sector juggling plates, and what we're doing is juggling plates, and people get really stressed because they're terrified of dropping any of the plates, because if the plates smash, it's game over. Whereas I use the analogy of glass balls and plastic balls, which isn't mine, by the way. I got it from somebody else, but I can't for the life of me remember the source. So apologies to listeners if it's you listening, if it's you writing and telling me that was my idea. But anyway, I think it's brilliant, because actually what we're doing is juggling balls. And some of those balls are glass and some of them are plastic. And the thing about the plastic balls is if you drop them, they won't break. They'll still be there ready for you to pick up later. The glass balls are the key ones. And the glass balls are the ones you've got to prioritize, because if you drop those smash. And actually, when you sit down and look at all the stuff you have to do and decide what's glass balls and what's plastic, you'll find that very few of the balls are actually glass, and most of them are plastic. It can wait till next month, or it can wait till next year. Or like, even when you're thinking about strategies, you know, a 5-year strategy, you don't have to start everything right now. You can say, right, this year we're going to prioritize this strategic objective. And then in 2 years' time, once we've made headway in that, we're then going to move on to the next strategic objective. Whereas people tend to think, here's our strategic objective, we've got to start all of them now. And, you know, and that you absolutely don't have to do that. So yeah, glass balls and plastic balls. I just found it the cleverest way of looking at how you decide what matters and what doesn't. And that then helps you, as you say, Peter, to manage your time better. Because, like, why am I, you know, at 10 o'clock on a Sunday dealing with a plastic ball? That makes absolutely no sense. When the glass ball might be your family. You know, you've dropped that ball by not spending time with them, whatever. So, yeah, I find that quite handy.
Yeah, no, that's very good advice. That might lead into another question, particularly about leadership. What skills or qualities do you consider essential for successfully leading a charity in the current environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to generalize, isn't it? Because you need different skills at different times. I mean, the skills you need when you're setting up and starting out a small charity based in the community are probably not quite the same skills that you need when you're leading a multi-million-pound large charity, you know, in a different sector. I remember Martin Neri when he was leading at Barnardo's, and when he stepped down from the role, because I think his background was in social services, and when he stepped down from the role, he wrote a piece for The Guardian where he said one of the reasons why he wanted to move on from Barnardo's is because his passion was about, you know, helping young people, but he spent most of his time in a suit arguing about strategies and budgets and, you know, that sort of stuff, which is what wasn't what he wanted to do in the role. So, so I think it entirely depends. I think, you know, the one of them is, which I've mentioned before, is resilience, the ability to bounce back. And I think people misuse resilience. It's like you just keep going until you drop dead. That's not resilience. Resilience is not ploughing on regardless till you kill yourself. Resilience is being able to hit a blockage or hit a setback and look at it, frame it appropriately, and move on from it without carrying it all with you. That's what resilience is for me. It's not just working all the hours God sends, which some people miss. So I think resilience, definitely. Also flexibility. I mean, you know, DSC, God knows, we say to ourselves, how the hell are we still here? Given all the challenges that we face, given all the competition that there is in the sector for our kind of work, you know, and our competitors are not really other big charities. They're all these chief executives who are leaving and setting up their own consultancies. You know, that's the biggest challenge to us at DSC. But one of the reasons we've survived is because we're incredibly fast and flexible. We're very, very quick to change what we do. We're very quick to let go of something that's not working. We're always experimenting with structures, who reports to who and what jobs people do. And we have a philosophy in DSC, which is, you know, everybody's job is your job. You know, you don't get to say that's not my job, because we could not survive if everybody just stuck to their own jobs because we're too small. So, yeah, so resilience and flexibility, I would say. And also the ability to infuse others, because one of to be able to like paint a picture of the vision that you're trying to change. Because in my experiences, if you can tell the story of why you're doing the work you do, all sorts of things come after you. You know, you get the volunteers, you get the funders, you get the ear of the minister, if you can tell the story about why it actually matters. So I guess those three things.
Yeah.
How about you?
Very good. No, I would that all sounds spot on to me. I think being available to people when they need you, I think accessible. That doesn't mean going out and about and walking around every corridor, and when you can't even do it anymore with so many people kind of working at home. But having when you have no time at all because you've got so many problems and worries and concerns, but giving the sense that you've got time for people when they need you is important, because again, I think that energizes and inspires people to know that you are there and creates permission for them to get on with the particular things which you regard as important. If you've got your kind of vision and the things that you want to enthuse people on straight, and you just keep saying those things over and over again and creating the conditions for others to flourish. The temptation is to be.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
The temptation is to be a personal performer and take more and more onto yourself, because things get more and more difficult, and more people are feeling worried or concerned about this or that. Whereas actually, if you can be the orchestrator and the enabler, then more will be achieved, I think.
This is a supplementary question, actually, from me, which has just occurred to me. So this isn't a reader's question. I've cheated, but I'm just really interested because you were very senior in the civil service. Yeah. Then you were the chief executive, a major funder, probably the biggest funder in our sector, and then the chief executive of a delivery charity. Do you think there were different skills that you needed in each of those three roles?
Yes, definitely. I mean, more similarities in the second two. Yeah. To be a senior civil servant, I think I needed to be intellectually sharp and able to turn things around quickly, able to distinguish and understand what it was that ministers individually and collectively wanted, and interpret their signals in order to do what they wanted, but also to shape and challenge what it was they wanted. So that felt a bit more of a game, I would say, really, an intellectually kind of challenging one. But whereas as the chief executive, I needed to shape not just the kind of content of what we were doing, but how we were doing it, and think about values, think about behaviors, think about building teams and roles, and organizing to deliver as well, rather than in the civil service. It was more, everyone had a kind of name and a kind of job description, and you sort of move them around in a bit more of a regimented fashion. When I moved to the NSPCC, leading and managing inspiring volunteers, that was a whole new dimension from running a Quango. And of course, fundraising. In the lottery, the money just poured in from people buying lottery tickets, whereas at the NSPCC, it had to be generated from other. So that required a whole other kind of dimension of leadership as well, and how to balance in the end, you can't do anything without the money. But if you look like a money bag and that all you're interested in is money, then you lose sight of the purpose of what you're there for. So that was a new kind of dimension of leadership to me, which I enjoyed, and was distinctly different from the first two jobs, where, as I say, money was just, there was never enough of it, but it was always there. You didn't actually have to generate it as well as spend it.
That's brilliant, Peter. What's next?
If you could go back to the beginning of your career, is there any advice you'd give yourself, knowing what you know now about leadership in the charity sector? Oh,
this really makes me laugh. I get asked this all the time. People say, before you, especially people who are thinking about becoming a chief exec, or, what advice would you give yourself? I'm like, don't do it.
Oh, I would say do it. I thought you were going to
say, years.
I would absolutely say do it.
I'm joking. I think the advice I'd give myself is don't take it all so personally. 99% of the problems that you will encounter are not caused by you. They're not generated by you. You have to solve them, and you have to take responsibility for fixing them. But it's not. So in the early days, I took every failure deeply personally, every failure of the money coming in, every failure of not hitting budget, every failure of a member of staff not working out or having to leave, whatever. Every one of those I took really personally. And then as time went on, and it kept happening, I realised that actually there's a world in which we operate, and there's so much over we really don't have any control. And so all we can do is control the things we can control, and then don't get that stabbing pain to our hearts when something happens that we couldn't have anticipated or we couldn't control. So I'd say don't take things be deeply committed to the cause. But, in the event, in the leadership actions and behaviours that you have to engage in, you will get it wrong. You will make mistakes, but don't let it dent your confidence or your belief in your ability to do the work that you need to do in order to achieve the cause. So probably that.
Yeah.
You
don't get photographed with a glass of champagne.
Oh yes, the infamous. Was it the Mail?
Sun. I was on front page of the Sun.
When it was the Isle of Wight, wasn't it? At a donor's.
No, Jersey.
Jersey.
It was even more glamorous.
Somewhere.
Yeah, I'd only been doing the job about 3 weeks, and
you want to tell the listeners about it, Peter?
Not really.
Well, it was so unfair.
Yeah, and I suppose it's plays to what you said about resilience, and things can go wrong, but they're not really. It's all fine. Yeah. So for those who don't know, probably about a couple of months into starting at the NSPCC, we'd had a fundraising event in Jersey, and a donor, I think I might have talked about this before actually, a donor had a party to thank everyone who participated in his back garden, which is a beautiful place overlooking the sea in Jersey. And it wasn't even a glass of champagne, actually, it was a glass of wine, and I had my photograph taken. It was a nice picture, and I made it my profile picture on Facebook, where it sat for quite a long time, until some months later it was lifted off there by the Sun and made as the main picture for a splash about overpaid charity chief executives with the headline "Gimme, Gimme, Gimme." And Peter Wanless, chief executive of the NSPCC, quaffs champagne whilst, quotes, working, unquotes, in Jersey. It used to pop up from time to time as a kind of case study in charity communications for some years to come. But I used to say about it, these things do happen. And so my line was, it was a very nice picture, actually. And most of the people in the newspaper just look at the pictures. They didn't really read the story. My family thought it was a nice picture, and they were quite excited that I was in the newspaper, and they bought extra copies for that reason, without really kind of missing the point that this was a bit of a hatchet job on me and other
well-paid chief executives. I also doubt very much. I mean, you probably don't remember at the time, but it did very much to dent giving or volunteering for the NSPCC. I mean, that's certainly been my experience. Every time there's been a scandal about highly paid charity chief executives, there might be a small dip briefly, but then it goes back up again really rapidly. So those sort of scandal-driven stories, on the whole, I mean, it may well have had a massive impact on fundraising at NSPCC, but I'd be surprised.
No, it was the fact that I was newish to the job made me more nervous about it than I probably should have been. Because, I mean, when these things happen, it's always an opportunity for people who are thinking about cancelling their direct debits to do that. But no, I think we rode that one out. And the trustees were very, very supportive throughout the whole thing, actually. So, yes, that would probably be a career low light, though. What about a career highlight? That was one other question we had. Have you got a career highlight that you'd like to share?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, so many, but the trouble is I've never thought of myself as having a career. It's like I've been very lucky to always do jobs I've absolutely loved doing. And and I genuinely say this, by the way, I've been super privileged. I was born with advantages, not into a wealthy family at all, but into a military family where I was stable employment, a stable home. I mean, we moved around every 2 years. By the time I was 20, we'd lived in, I think, 17 different homes in, various different countries. So there's a lot of instability. I had to get sent away to school. So I'm very conscious that I was very privileged because I was brought up in a family that was committed to learning, that read books, so with loads of support. So I never ever like to say that I got here just because I'm brilliant, because I don't think that's true. I had a massive head start over many other people in the sector. But I think that there are moments, aren't there, where because most of the time when you're in a leadership role, your achievements are not yours at all. Your achievements are all the works of other people. When you're the chief exec, there's very little that you personally do that you can actually take credit for. Most of what you're doing is you're creating the space for other people to shine and to have highlights of their own. But I will say, I know we've mentioned before, but I think probably writing It's a Battle on the Board, it had been years in the making and years of being the victim of really poor board governance and like counselling people who had really poor governance and, putting back the pieces of charities where the governance has been really terrible. And so, and realising what the problems are and then just sort of pouring that out all into this one book of, look, don't do this, don't be an idiot. This is where it can go wrong. People get murdered if you get it wrong. For God's sake, keep everybody safe. And so I would say that's, I've written about 10 books, I think, but of all the ones I've written, that's the one of which I'm most proud. I mean, I look at it now and there's loads I change, because you always do that. It's like, I should have written that better and I could have included that story. But on the whole, I'm proud. And it's still a DSC bestseller. And we published it, I think it's on its second or third reprint. And we published it, I think, in, I want to say 2020, maybe 2021. So a few years ago now. And it's still consistently hits the top of our DSC bestseller list. So yeah, I'm very proud of that.
It's a very good book.
Thank you, Peter.
Regularly flagged by me on this podcast. And yes, we'll talk about my charity chairing days in the nearest future, I think.
Yeah.
That's such a good point about so many, achievements or things people point to aren't really personal triumph. And very often no one quite knows where they come from. But there was one. So when I was at the Big Lottery Fund and the 2010 election happened and the coalition government came in, and there was talk of the Big Lottery Fund being abolished and the shares being returned to the original causes, which sounded deceptively attractive. Arts, sports, heritage, charities. And that would have been 25, 25, 25, 25 of all the proceeds to good cause from each. But charities and community groups were getting 50% through the New Opportunities Fund and the Communities Fund when you added them together. And the idea of giving, who's not going to want to give more money to sports, arts and heritage? The trouble was the victims would have been charities, and the money was not only it didn't just sort of sit there in a bank. It had been pre-committed to lots of charities 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, and so for a government to kind of come in and just reduce it immediately to 25, it would have been catastrophic for lots and lots of charities. And there was, willful attempts to choose not to understand that point because it made for very popular headlines with a lot of newspapers. And I had been recruited, I think, into that role because I'd worked with Conservative ministers as well as with Labour ministers in the past. And it was a bit of a kind of test of could I persuade them to do all of this. And in the end, there was a transition period, but it was reduced from 50 down to 40, which was still a good amount of money for charities to get. No one had to go to the wall because all the existing grants were protected. And also with the changes that were all going on, and David Cameron was talking about the big society and all of this, we managed to get what was called a transition fund, which was £100 million for charities to help them cope with the new situation. And I'm not saying that £100 million came because I was the chief executive of the Big Lottery Fund, but through all those kind of conversations, that was another piece of the discussions, and we were a trusted distributor to take that money and hand it out in a not too bureaucratic way. And I remember coming home from work when that was announced, thinking, God, it's not every day that you get given £100 million to distribute. It can't get much better than this. So that was probably a highlight.
Oh, how wonderful. I think we've run out of questions now, haven't we? And I think we've also run out of time.
That's for sure. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that was a little bit different.
Yeah, good fun though.
Yeah, hope it was interesting to folk. And if there are things that you'd like us to discuss in future, let us know. We are going to take a week's break for Easter. So we will next be back, I think, with you all on the 1st of May.
Is that right? Yeah, 1st of May. That's what it is. So there'll be last week's podcast, which you will have heard, this week's, and then next week we're on a break. So
see you on the 1st of May.
Brilliant. On the 1st.